Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to another online debate organized by the Martin Center, this time in cooperation with the Fletcher School of Law and Diplomacy of the Tufts University of Boston. My name is Margherita Movarelli, Head of Communications and Marketing at the Martin Center, and I will be with you for the next 1 hour moderating this online debate on the future of transatlantic relations. Today, we are going to discuss a number of issues connected to the impact of the coronavirus pandemic on the relations between the two sides of the Atlantic. Before the outbreak of the global health crisis, the Martin Center published a paper on transatlantic relations written by Professor Arbanitopoulos, which I am soon going to introduce. The main thesis of the paper, titled The Renewal of Vows, is that a new transatlantic chapter is possible. I won't tell you more, Professor will do that, and the paper is also available for download on our website. Many things have changed in between, and the new set of challenges have emerged. The issue of the future of the transatlantic alliance certainly remains on top of the political agenda, and that's why we are here today. We have three excellent speakers with us that will help us make sense of the situation. So let me briefly introduce them. Alexander Stubb, former Prime Minister of Finland, now Director and Professor at the School of Transnational Governance of the European University Institute of Florence. Konstantin Arbanitopoulos, Professor of International Politics at the Fletcher School, our partner in this webinar. Professor is a former Minister of Education of Greece and Senior Research Associate at the Martin Center as well. And last but by no means least, Jan Lesser, Vice President at the German Marshall Fund of the United States and Executive Director of the Brussels office of GMF. Welcome and thank you all for being with us today. So before we start with the first round of questions, I would like first thing first, to encourage our online viewers to ask questions directly on our live streaming Facebook page. I will try to take as many questions as possible so that we make this an interactive discussion. And now let's start with you, Director Stubb. In your past and new roles, you have had hands-on experience on geopolitics and international affairs. COVID-19 is a global crisis. And as such, it will also impact the global balance of powers. And the transatlantic partnership, we know that was already under strain before. So what should we expect now and what should be Europe's strategy?
Yeah, I mean, thanks first of all for the invite and I think an excellent topic. I'm actually working on a book right now, which has a working title, The New World Disorder, Power in the 21st Century. And my big thesis is that we're going to start seeing three major players emerging. One of them is China, one the United States, and one Europe and the European Union. I think the COVID element in this will play an important role. And I think COVID will probably be judged on the basis of three criteria. One is quite morbid, that's the death toll, how well do various entities, countries and regions do. Number two is the economy and the way in which we bounce back from an economic recession come depression. And third one is information war. In other words, who comes out of this the best. My big thesis, if I can throw one out right here in the beginning and very shortly, I'm an avid transatlanticist, but I actually think that the European Union at this particular moment with the current administration will have to become extremely geopolitical. And that for me means that we don't throw the baby out with the bathwater. We're still 75% American, so to speak, but with 25%, we have to play ball with China as well. So this is an opportunity for Europe to stick to our values with America, but at the same time realize that China is a new superpower and we need to play ball with them. That would be my thesis for the day.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I would like to turn immediately to Ian Lester, as he has much experience on transatlantic relations as well. Because deterioration of the U.S. and EU relations over the past years, certainly, especially corresponding to the Trump administration. This has been attributed to Trump's policies and attitude mostly. However, it is becoming also increasingly evident that Trump's policy may reflect deeper structural changes in the American foreign policy establishment, also in the American public opinion regarding relations with Europe. If this is true, what is to be done about it, Jan? Jan, maybe.
Thank you. No, I'm here. I'm with you. And I apologize in advance for the slight disconnect between voice and video, but hopefully you can hear me all right. Margarita, thank you for the question. I mean, maybe the thing I can say in my personal capacity anyway is the answer to your last point, which is, we needed a different result in the election in November. This is step one in changing things. But to the spirit of your question, it's not so easy to get a reset. Yes, you could reset the style. That's for sure. I mean, there is something extraordinarily unique, distinctive, mercurial, difficult, destructive, even in my view, of what we've seen in the last years from Washington. And I really do think that is a product of the Trump administration per se. In that said, there will be issues where it may be difficult for Europe to get a different result. Some may be easier, but on things like trade, clearly there were pent-up forces, structural things that were going to make life difficult. And of course, there are changes adjustments have taken place in China, in Europe, and elsewhere. So even if you reset American policy by some miracle, it's not at all clear that everyone else is going to follow suit. Some of these things may be difficult to reverse, and in a sense, history maybe has been given a shove. On certain things Europe clearly cares about, like climate diplomacy, maybe even Iran. I do think there is something, at least the nuclear file with Iran, I think there is some potential for movement there for sure. If you were to have a Biden administration, I think they could be even tougher on China, in fact, in some respects. They certainly could be tougher on Russia. So it's not necessarily a smooth road, but what you will have is a very distinct difference in style. And frankly, that does make a huge difference. And we haven't even spoken about the extraordinary events that are taking place in the United States, as we speak. This really could have geopolitical consequences. We can talk about that. But if nothing else, it's going to be an immense distraction for Americans over the next months and years, potentially, which will make it harder to get foreign policy done. But I still think we've had something of an aberration, and we have a chance to see something different after November.
Yeah, and here I would like to turn to Professor Vanitopoulos. Professor, you've spent the past year living and teaching in the US. What is the situation and the mood there in times of presidential elections, with this pandemic going on and a new wave of riots also disrupting the country? How do you see the future of America, and do you see Europe in its future as a traditional strong ally?
A couple of things. First, let me thank the Martin Center for the opportunity to write this policy paper, and I want to thank my esteemed colleagues for being with us today and accepting the invitation of the Martin Center. Let me say that what we are experiencing now in the United States is sort of the tale of two cities, and unfortunately, this is not new in the United States. In 1984, Mario Cuomo in the Democratic Convention had made a great speech about the tale of two cities and the wide inequalities in the United States. Well, guess what? These inequalities have widened over the past years because of neoliberal economic policies, because of globalization, because of the technological revolution. And what has happened in these unfortunate events over the last years is that we had the background of a symbolism having an African-American black man asphyxiating by the knee of a white policeman on his neck while lying down cuffed and harmless on the street. And that has ignited a fire. It has brought back the demons of racial injustice and discrimination that has not been put to rest, even after a presidency by Barack Obama, having the first African-American assuming the highest office in the land. So what has happened is that all these racial injustices, the demons of the past, have resurfaced in the American society, and you see all these riots and violence. I think that President Trump has been the great divider of the American nation, and as a matter of fact, the path that he has tried to follow since the day before yesterday is a dividing path. He is trying to change the situation into a law and order case rather than tackle the issues of injustice, racial discrimination, and inequalities in the American society. And this has exacerbated tensions. Now, going back to the transatlantic relations, I mean, Trump has been the president that we love to hate when it comes to transatlantic relations. And the truth of the matter is that relations between the two sides of the Atlantic have taken a turn to the worse under the Trump administration. But I think that Trump is the epiphenomenon. There are wider and deeper changes that have been taking place within the American society. And I want to talk about three things. The first one is that there has been fatigue in the American society, in the American public, with continuous foreign entanglements of the United States abroad. The second is that there is a change of focus away from Europe that has been characterized by this famous pivot to Asia, that the rise of China represents now the highest priority for the American foreign policy and American strategy. And I think the third is that there has been a just claim on the part of the American foreign policy establishment that the Europeans should pick up the tab now, that they should really, having enjoyed being free riders for a large part of the Cold War, there is time now that they pick up the tab, that they contribute more in the defense expenditures of the alliance and the security issues, the famous burden-sharing issue. Now, having said all that, my thesis is quite different than what some in the United States and certainly this current administration has proposed for transatlantic relations. I think the constitutional elements of transatlantic relations of the Atlantic Alliance are still here. We still have common values, we still have common interests, and we still face common challenges. And some of those challenges will not be faced if we see a decoupling between the two sides of the Atlantic. And by those, I mean climate change, I mean, the fear and the threat of new pandemics like COVID-19 and so many that we have witnessed after 1985. Let me remind everybody that since 1985, we have gone through 5 pandemics. So the threat of pandemics, climate change, the inequalities of globalization and the need to regulate globalization, technological innovations, AI, artificial intelligence, and so on, the limits to growth, these are global changes, these are global challenges that cannot be tackled effectively if we see a decoupling between the two sides of the Atlantic. And a final comment that has to do with China. We hear an argument from many corners of the American establishment that, now our priority is China and we need to pivot to Asia. Well, I think that this is a wrong strategy for the following reason. You cannot have a geopolitical response to a regional issue, namely to sustain or restore the balance of power in Southeast Asia, affect a global policy which is tackling the challenge of a global, of the rise of a global China. In other words, what I mean is that China is not a regional power anymore. It is a rising superpower with global aspirations and global reach. You cannot contain China just by pivoting to Asia, because China is not anymore just in Asia. With the Belt and Road Initiative is everywhere. China is in Eurasia, China is in Africa. Well, guess what? China is in the shores of Europe. So you need a global policy. You need a global strategy to face the challenge of China. And I think an effective global challenge on strategy on the part of the United States has the requirement of the Western unity, presupposes the unity between the two sides of the Atlantic. Otherwise, we are going to have two inefficient strategies. One on the part of the United States that will start pivoting to Asia to tackle a regional challenge that is not a regional challenge anymore, and the same thing on the part of Europe. I say that the transatlantic relationship needs to remain strong because China poses a global threat, a global challenge. So the West, as a geopolitical actor, needs to remain united to have an effective response to this global challenge.
Professor, indeed, you mentioned the US abdication from the European theater. So let me bring this back to Alexander Stubb. How do you see the US reacting to this, and what direction is the US taking in the future vis-a-vis to Europe? Because we have noticed that the Trump administration has proven very confrontational with China, at least recently, and very ambiguous in its relationship with Russia. And Europe seems to be right in the middle. So where do you think the strategy of the U.S. administration is going?
Well, I'm pretty much with both Ian and Konstantinos on this. I think if there's one thing where there seems to be consensus in the US, that is the China policy. And that is not a, how would I say, policy of containment as such. It's a very confrontational approach. I'm not saying it's the new Cold War, because I think it's very difficult for the US to be engaged in a new Cold War because of the binary and bipartisan approach that the country has at the moment. It's a very divided country. But on China, it seems to be, I think, pretty united. So much like Ian said, I don't think there's going to be much of a change if Joe Biden snatches the presidency in November or not. I'm not sure whether presidential elections are going to take place at all in the US. Looking at the rate in which the current president is acting and using his prerogative, I just hope that the checks and balances of power in the United States stand on the side of lasting institutions and democracy. But that's just a side note. I also agree with Konstantinos that we should not be looking at China anymore as a regional power. It's a global power. Whether you use the Belt and Road Initiative as your marker, whether you use technological acquisitions as your marker. For a while back, I think in 2016, I wrote a Financial Times column, which I rather provocatively named For China, Europe is the new Africa. And here my argument was that what China had done to Africa in terms of exploiting natural resources, it was doing on IPO and technological acquisitions in Europe. And that was, if you recall, the time when the Ekstrom case hit the scene and the public scene. So, you know, I do, to come back to your sort of earlier question and the sort of tone on your second question, I really think Europe needs to play a careful balancing act. And that's why I call the 75-25 metaphor, in the sense that it's extremely important that we stay true to our American friends and our allies. But at the same time, we do have to realize that American power is not projected in an engaged way, in the way in which it used to be. So to a certain extent, and I hate to say this as a strong and avid pro-American, which I consider to be myself, my second home, but you cannot trust American foreign policy at the moment. And when that's the case, you have to be a little bit more selfish. I think the big tests are gonna come on the relationship with China. Is the U.S. going to be as strict on European relations with China as it was, for instance, with European relations with Iran? And I'd really like to hear Ian's take on that as well, because if we get into, when push comes to shove, and if American foreign policy becomes even more demanding on Europe, it's going to put Europe in a very difficult place. But I do stress, this is an opportunity for Europe to play geopolitics big time.
So thank you. Let me pass the question to Jan Lesser. Indeed, do you have any comments on that?
Well, thank you. And maybe just to follow up on several points actually that Alexander raised, with regard to China, there is something structural here. I mean, we talk about pivots to Asia and so forth, but perhaps, in grand historic terms, we're coming to the end of a 100-year American pivot to Europe, which is in fact what we've had. And of course, we are by definition a bi-oceanic country. So I think that is structural. I think there has been something unique about the Trump administration's approach with China, which has been built around this economic nationalism, which in fact is an impetus for a lot of different American policies these days. I think that would be somewhat different, probably with a different administration, even if a different Republican administration. But the basic fact of a kind of growing tension in the Indo-Pacific, growing tension strategically with China is there. And I would go further and say, there is something particularly risky, dangerous here about the combination of this lack of erosion of a sense of economic interdependence with China on the one hand, and an increasingly confrontational strategic relationship at sea, whether we're talking about Taiwan or whether it's something over Hong Kong. Anyway, all of these flashpoints were in a sense stabilized in the past because of this sense of economic interdependence that nobody really wanted to pull on this string. Will that still be there? And after, some years of this being eroded, and of course, Chinese policy, as I said, has evolved as well, that's going to be very difficult. So if something does go wrong in one of these places, the chances of it somehow escalating are greater. And that's really risky. I completely agree. This is not a good sort of outlook for Europe, even if Europe is more capable of projecting a concerted policy, and I hope it is personally. Europeans don't want to have to choose in that sense, between the United States and China. I mean, and it is, I would agree, it's 75-25 in a sense, if you had to put numbers on it. It is rather like that. But I think a lot of this can be improved, frankly, if the U.S. relationship with Europe on a whole set of other issues is better. And I think that is really possible. We can talk about what some of those things are. I think that would make that somewhat more comfortable situation for a more geopolitical Europe.
I have a follow-up question for Stuba. It's we know pretty much what's inside the 75%, although the picture has been changing a lot. Defense is certainly a big chapter. Trade is certainly a big chapter. But I'm wondering what's inside the 25% that you mentioned of new relationships that Europe should develop also with China and with other political forces.
I think you want to simplify it. I would say that with the United States, the whole basis is values. So if and when we're in the process of seeing a technological revolution, digital revolution, the fourth industrial revolution, whatever you want to call it, the ultimate decisions on algorithms, for instance, will be based on a certain set of values. I think surveillance and privacy are good examples of this. So we're talking basically tech giants here. Here, it's quite clear that Europe and the United States must work together. I also think that obviously on traditional trade issues, on climate, and hopefully on multilateralism as well, I think there's some foreign policy and security policy issues, say for instance on Syria or Libya, and actually on Iran as well. I know it's a bit paradoxical, where we need to cooperate. There are issues linked to, say, Venezuela and to authoritarian regimes around the world, where I think it's very important. UN cooperation between the P5 countries, in this particular case, the UK, France, and the US, I think is important. So that sort of set is quite clear there. I think with China, it's more linked to probably issues of the new economy. And by that I mean some technological issues which are not necessarily directly linked to privacy. I think climate is something that we should cooperate very closely with China. And here, I'm not. My thesis is that in order for us to solve the climate crisis, we need, of course, to have the regulatory framework of China on board, but we also need to have the technological framework of China abroad. See, my big fear is that from the opening of China from 1979 forward, there were two theses there. One is the economic opening, and everyone was really cool about it, if I may use the term. In other words, everyone said, yeah, let's go for it. China is becoming market-oriented, capitalist, and the rest of it. So we all went on this bandwagon where we said that trade with China is great, let China do cheap manufacturing, and this is really good. Now that China has showed that it's actually also an economic superpower, and its balance of trade has fundamentally changed, its international direct investment is going outbound, not coming in. I hope that Europe doesn't do the same reaction the other way around, and sort of 180 degrees, and they say, wait, now there's nothing we want to do with the Belt and Road Initiative, and strategic autonomy, which I think is a good concept, will then just become a pretext for, protectionism against China. So what I'm trying to say is that we need to find a balance, stick with America, but find various areas where you can cooperate with China. I mean, obviously, we don't even have a fully fledged free trade agreement with China because of investment issues, and these types of issues we need to work on. So I'm still an avid multilateralist and globalist, and I believe that we need a common rules-based framework with China.
Absolutely, it's a very slippery slope, and it's not. Indeed, as you mentioned, very easy to strike a good balance, especially because China belongs together with Russia to a completely different set of regimes, which we don't consider part of the Western liberal order. So I would like to go back to this topic with you, Konstantin. We've been studying a lot populist movements, and it seems that both in the US and Europe, populism is suffering from a decrease in its consensus right now, meaning that in a certain way, we should feel reassured within the West that this wave of populism seems to be toned down for the moment. But do you see this as a trend that will remain in the midterm, or should we expect a new wave of consensus for populist movements as a result of the tremendous economic and social unrest caused by the corona crisis?
Well, let me. I'll come right to the answer of the question, but give me a moment to take issue with a couple of comments that were made before, and have to do with the term of geopolitical Europe and also the term of strategic autonomy, because I think these are important points that Alexander made, and I wouldn't agree more, but I have a few caveats on those. And the one is that when we talk about geopolitical Europe, that means a projection of hard power. And we all know that this is a gradual process, that whereas Europe as a global order does have the abilities to project hard power, we know that this as a policy and as a process is a gradual process that will require some time to come to fruition. And the second has to do with strategic autonomy. And I would prefer at the moment the term of strategic complementarity. For the reasons that I mentioned before, in the sense that I still believe that the role of the United States, even after it has abdicated sort of its role in the European continent, remains as a very valid offshore balancer in what is happening in Europe. The second is because we still have the same interests and the same values. We still have the same values, despite all the wave of populism that we see in both sides of the Atlantic. So I would prefer the strategic term of strategic complementarity rather than strategic autonomy. And one more.
Can I just on that?
Yes, please.
Just to get. I know it's on video. It's always difficult to get a conversation going. But can I just sort of push you on one issue here? I mean, strategic complementarity or autonomy. I think it's a good debate to have. Can I differ a little bit of opinion on when you said that geopolitics is about hard power? I don't think it is anymore. And this is what Europe needs to realize, that geopolitics used to be considered purely as hard power. But for me, for instance, nowadays, financial markets, currency, trade, and free trade, they're all about geopolitics. I mean, look at the way in which trade instruments are being used, for instance, by the current president of the United States. So my argument is that Europe needs to wake up and smell the coffee and understand that it's not anymore only about traditional economic soft power, that economic power is also hard power. Therefore, geopolitical power is not by definition anymore only hard power. That would just be my comment, and I would ask for your, what do you think about that?
I agree on that. But all these elements of power have also the requirement of the ability to project hard power as well. All these elements of power are true, and they're there. And also, to be fair, Europe has been projecting hard power in various instances, both in the Mediterranean and so on and so forth. But it's the ability and the perception of the ability to project hard power is still not there. All the other elements that you mentioned are there, and I couldn't but agree more with you. And one more thing, if I may, with Europe's relations with China. And here I think that if I beg to differ a little bit is on the fact that Europe does not have a clear position vis-a-vis China. We see many independent relations and trade agreements between China and independent European member states like Greece, Italy, Hungary, and so on and so forth. And at the same time, the Commission coming up with a strategic document that begs to differ and tries to contain those independent trade agreements and so on and so forth. So still we have not formulated as Europeans, as United Europe, a common strategy as far as China is concerned. And the third element that has to do with populism, there's no question about it that populism has swept both sides of the Atlantic. And when actually I was teaching a course on the global rise of populism, and we spend more time talking about Trump rather than European populism in Europe, for example. And here I also want to start agreeing with the notion that we see something more than populism developing in the United States, but I would leave it at that. I wouldn't go further on that argument. But populism is the name of the day, We've seen it in Trump's case. It's a narcissistic populism that does cherry picking on different ideological schools of thought, from Jacksonian populism to realism to isolationism to economic protectionism that was mentioned by Ian and Alexander as well. So we see this new brand of populism in the United States, and of course it's a very ugly sight. And the question is whether we're going to see a second wave of populism as a result of the economic consequences of the great pandemic of COVID-19. And this is, you know, the $64 million question. But if you have 40 million unemployed in the United States, and everybody's talking about a Great Depression and also a Great Recession coming to Europe, one cannot but think that we should expect a second wave of populism.
Ian, you're also a very careful observer of realities across the pond. So how do you see, do you agree with this possibility of a second wave of populism in the US, but also in Europe?
Well, look, also what you're seeing in the United States today shows you that all sorts of things are possible. And I'm not sure that what we're seeing animating the unrest in the United States today is populism per se. I think what we're having, frankly, is a return of ideology in a very traditional way. There are a lot of pent-up grievances on both sides of the Atlantic. I would say that even in Europe, if you look at the experience of the Gilets jaunes and other things, and of course Europe has its own experience with racism and xenophobia and a long-term sort of challenge for migration and how you accommodate that socially, politically. You know, Europe should not feel immune to this kind of thing. And if you put societies, advanced societies, under the stress of years of economic stringency, all sorts of surprising things can come from that. They also will come in the global south. And here again, you know, there is an issue that goes back to this question of what it takes to be more geopolitical. Yeah, the hard power piece is never going to go away. It's one of the metrics, but there are many other things. And, you know, if you go back to what really people used to talk, geopolitics now has become a term applied to almost everything. We sort of know what people mean, but, you know, when people started talking about geopolitics 100 years ago or more, the term had a specific meaning, which related to geography. You can't escape that. And Europe has its own geography, and it has its own strategic concerns flowing from that. And you can't escape them, whether it's in the Balkans or North Africa or the Maghreb, Eurasia, it's going to be there. So the demand for a more geopolitical, to use that overused term, Europe is going to be there, I think. And the other point I would make about this, and in a way it links the two questions, the domestic one and the external one, is that between the health crisis and the economic crisis, you know, citizens are going to be expecting more of governments everywhere. They're going to become more demanding. Their definition of security is likely to expand and change. You know, so when Macron or others talk about, you know, a France that protects or a Europe that protects, that I think is going to become a very, very critical sort of question. So there will be a demand for this, not just from political elites who want more strategic autonomy. That's not what matters to the average person. What matters to the average person is government or institutions protecting you. And that, I think, will drive Europe in this direction that we've been talking about as well. It will have different instruments, but I think the demand will be there. I happen to be among those Americans who think that's ultimately in American interest, as long as we're basically on the same page in terms of how we think about the world. This is a multiplier for American power, if we want to be selfish about it. But the relationship, that works both ways. The United States can be a multiplier for European power. A final comment. I mean, people talk all the time about the United States disengaging from Europe. In fact, there's more American military presence in Europe today than there was years ago.
Exactly.
It started under Obama. It's continued under Trump. I can well imagine it continuing in the next administration for objective reasons. So, and this, you know, you can see something similar even in the Middle East, where there are shifts of interest for sure, but we're not going away. So I think we need to be careful about that. But to the extent that Europe can do more on burden sharing, and any American administration is going to want that, if we're working together, it seems to me the costs of having this more geopolitical, protective approach will be less for everyone.
Yeah, thank you, Jan. And I see that there are questions coming from our online viewers, so maybe we can start with a couple of those. Well, one is related to China, and I think in a way we have answered this question. A lot of, and it's coming from our policy director, Roland Freudenstein, a lot of pundits and politicians in the US are now talking about decoupling from China and trying to get Europe on board. But can anybody really decouple China, especially economically, even the US? Or are we all just going to become somewhat less dependent in technology and pharma? I don't know, Alexander Stubb, maybe if you want to take this one.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I guess a simple answer, do not decouple. Take China seriously and play ball. I mean, that's a sort of simple way of going about it. And when we do that, I think we need to realize that China is not going to become a Western-style democracy. It simply is not. So we can forget when we've been used to projecting power for our way of life. It's been about saying that the most successful societies are based on a liberal democracy, social market economy, and globalization. Well, China will probably stick to the globalization piece, but it'll have its very own approach. It is capitalist, it is authoritarian, it is autocratic, it is centralized, and it will not become a liberal democracy. I mean, it will probably take a few tenets from here and there, and it'll be stretching its sort of limits with Hong Kong. There'll be issues probably linked to Taiwan at one stage or another. But, for us to expect it to become that, it's not. So it's very different from Russia in that sense. Russia was a hard power. Same thing. I was naive enough as a Finn to believe that Russia would become a normal liberal democracy in the post-Cold War era, but it simply didn't. Now, the difference is that China seems to have a winning economic model, whereas Russia had a losing economic model. So that's why we have to look at China differently. The last thing we should do is decouple. The most important thing we need to do with China is to engage.
And we have also another question on the topic.
If I could make a comment on that before we...
Yeah, and then I will bring the other question.
I absolutely agree with Alexander that we need to engage rather than decouple from China. And if you look at China, you will see that China is a part-time member of the institutions of the liberal order. It has become a member of most institutions of the liberal order. As Alexander said, China will not become a Western democracy. This is certainly not the case, but we must engage so that we can avoid the Thucydides trap that Graham Allison has described and go to a confrontation. And the second point is that, and that has to do with European-American relations. I think if we witness some strain with regard to relations with China, will be on the issues that Roland mentioned, how do we deal with technology and the pharma industries. That there we need to have some independence as far as our technological firms and pharmaceutical firms are concerned.
Yeah, maybe.
I think Huawei is going to be a test case on this.
Right, exactly. Yeah.
And I saw another question there. Someone asking, Margarita, were you going to mention the one on yes, geopolitics, but what kind of geopolitics? Okay, so if I just push that one, and maybe I can get Ian to answer. I mean, I'll throw this out. I think Europe needs to start thinking strategically about 5G and technology. And we have two global companies in this field. They happen to be Nordic. Did I get cut off, by the way?
We see you. We hear you.
We could.
Yeah, you see, I mentioned.
Lost you a couple of minutes, but go ahead.
Yeah, I mentioned Huawei and immediately got cut off. You know,
Exactly.
This is what it is.
The Nordic company.
Just a couple of seconds. Go ahead.
Yeah. So what I wanted to say was that we need to be very strategic about the future of technology. More importantly, the infrastructure of technology. So that at the moment means 5G. And that's why I think Huawei is going to become one of these big issues. But in Europe, actually, if we want to be strategic, and I'm very careful when I say this, we do have two global network companies, and they're, of course, they happen to be Nordic. One is Ericsson and the other one is Nokia. So if I was in the European Commission at the moment and I was doing some strategic thinking, I'd be looking at these two companies and see, how do we deal with them, and them as network providers, because they're, of course, neutral providers and global players. And that would be a good way to play ball with the Americans as well, because the Americans are not going to go for Huawei. It's as simple as that. Yeah. And the other players that are in the field are simply, sorry to say this, null and void. Or irrelevant, and you can't build these companies out of nowhere. So that's why I think Ericsson and Nokia might have an interesting role in the future. But I'd really like to hear Ian's and Konstantinos' views on that.
Yeah, exactly. Let's start with you, Ian, if you have a comment, and then we go to the question that Alexander mentioned about geopolitics. And we've been speaking of a geopolitical Europe, but the question from our online viewers is what that means exactly.
Before he responds, can I add another question for Ian, a comment for Ian? Before, I think he said something very important. If I understood correctly, because I do apologize to Ian, but I can hear him very clearly. He mentioned, I believe, that there will be a new debate about the definition of the role of the state. Because of the crisis that we've seen, the pandemic crisis, the economic crisis coming up. And one comment that I want to make, and I would like him to respond to that. What we've seen out of this pandemic is an atavistic closure in the back to the nation state. But it seems to me that this is not sustainable in the long run. I mean, it can work and has worked for many countries as an emergency measure, a last resort measure. But all the problems that we all mention here are global problems. And this closure back to the nation state is not a sustainable long-term policy. That's, going back to what Ian said.
Yeah.
Well, on this point you make, Alexander, about, European sort of champions being, in a sense, available as an option to the Huawei possibility. I do think with a different administration in Washington that there would be a lot of openness to this. And it will largely be, yes, of course, it's private concerns that are involved, and you could imagine different kind of combinations that could exist across the Atlantic if you get the regulatory framework right. And that's, of course, one of the big areas for cooperation. But states will have a big role in driving this. Governments will have a big role in driving this, especially if they're putting a lot of money into national champions and subsidizing some of them. And I think there'll be more tolerance for that. I mean, this, after all, was basically what we were aiming for with TTIP. It was a strategic project in a sense around the sort of commercial containment of China. In a benign way, but with the proposition that if the United States and Europe did not have their act together in a regulatory fashion, that China would eat all of our lunch, if I could put it that way, to use an American term. I think we will have an opportunity to revisit that if publics and governments are willing to lead, leaders are willing to bring publics along with that kind of approach. So I think that's well worth thinking about. The other, and they may be the Nordics, for sure, in this sector. What kind of geopolitics? Well, it's a fair question. I mean, we've already had part of this debate. I mean, clearly it's not just about hard power. It's about a lot of other things. But it's also true that the hard power portion is making a comeback in a serious way, including things we haven't thought about for a long time, like nuclear strategy. make people very uncomfortable to have these debates about nuclear sharing and things like this. We haven't had those kinds of debates for decades. And we've been pulling at all of those strings, not just us, Russia as well. And so, the hard power piece will be there for sure, but there will be places in the European neighborhood, above all in Africa, I would say, where Europe can reach, can do things if Europe wants. And again, I think, there'll be more demand for that, and it should be in the American interest to see that, just as it's been true in the Balkans, say. Role of the state, well, it may be true, Konstantin, that this is not sustainable over the long term, but what do we mean by the long term? I mean, if you go back and look at the experience of the Depression, then even through economic recovery, the Marshall Plan, and all of these things, it was a big boost for the role of the state. It lasted for decades. Now, maybe in a certain sense, that's short term, but it's pretty long term in a policy context. And, I think we're on the brink of that kind of, maybe we're already there. If you're spending trillions on economic recovery, putting in place instruments that will take decades to resolve and pay off, we probably should do that. But nonetheless, that's not going to be a transient experience. That's going to be with us for some time.
And as you mentioned,
but is it? Yeah.
Sorry, no, go ahead if you have a comment, and then.
Yeah, I mean, just on the state versus market issue. I mean, I've always seen it very much as a pendulum which swings from one side to the other. I think, bringing in the Marshall Plan and the way in which the oil crisis was dealt with, I think is very good. And the way in which I tried, how we do it, we over-rationalize the past. But the way in which I try to over-rationalize the past is to say that, okay, 1989, the end of the Cold War, was a ideological watershed between two economic models, the capitalist model and the communist model. And then after 1989, it was all about market. And of course, if you look at the European Union, it's based on market liberalization. The four freedoms, tough rules of state aid, competition, and antitrust. So it's all about basically liberating the markets to act and function. And in Eastern and Central Europe, it's also about structural reform and market reform. Then I think the state started to make a slow comeback. I mean, the first comeback was, of course, post 9/11, where it's understandable that issues of security, fight against terrorism, that's not exactly a market type of an issue or an issue that the market can deal with. And then 2008, the financial crisis, I think that the state made a very strong comeback because, of course, first the states had to bail out the banks, and then the whole financial markets and structures had to be regulated in a new kind of a way. And then, of course, I think COVID 2020 is going to bring another onslaught of state with two facets. One is the sort of health and security facet, which is linked also, I would argue, to issues of privacy and surveillance. How far do we allow, our privacy to be compromised in the name of health security, if you will? That's going to be a tough one to crack, I think, especially in Europe. And it is right now a tough one to crack in the US, as we can see. Never underestimate the capacity of Joe Sixpack to go out on the street when his freedoms are encroached, if you know what I mean. And then the second caveat on this is the economic one. The rescue packages that we're seeing. Interesting enough, by the way, European rescue package is enormous. And remember, in the financial crisis, it took 4 years to get the ESM up and running. Now it was 4 weeks with a huge package from the ECB, the EIB, the ESM, the Sure Trust, and now the recovery plan. So, I do think it's a comeback of the state for the moment, and how far it'll go, I really don't know.
Yeah, no, I absolutely agree with all of that. I mean, I think it's absolutely right. And I think, even in the United States, we think of as this kind of bastion of market realism. This experience of the health crisis in particular, but coupled with the economic crisis, which is going to be durable, is putting all sorts of pressure on things that we've simply left to the market. Above all, the health sector in the United States. I mean, we're going to have people demanding, I think, in the United States, they already were, but they're going to be demanding even more some kind of substantial reform of this, and it's inevitably going to bring the state more into it. It's going to look more like Europe. Now, so my benign interpretation of all of this is that we could actually see the American and European social models, which we somehow thought of as drifting apart. In fact, they could be driven together unwittingly. Because on the one hand, in the United States, people are going to demand more, and only the state is going to be able to provide that safety net. On the other hand, in Europe, it's going to become less and less affordable. So it gets, this has already been happening. You're becoming a little more American in many of these ways. So you could willy-nilly have a kind of convergence in the coming years. And if we're smart about it, maybe we'll even compare notes and draw some lessons from this, so that we're not all making the same mistakes.
So thank you. Indeed, there are many perspectives. Another perspective that our online viewers are bringing up to the table is the TTIP treaty, so trade. We've been mentioning that, Jan, you've mentioned that very quickly. So one question is, do you consider a TTIP treaty is still possible, assuming Trump is gone after coming elections? And then we have a question from our executive director, Tommy Hutanen. What could be the next big EU-US project after TTIP? So maybe we can do a round of comments starting from Alexander Stubb, and then Konstantin, and then Jan.
Sure. When a Finn is asking, it's always a short question, so therefore the Finn has to give a short answer. I think do it in two phases. Number one, continue to work on TTIP. The issues linked to TTIP have gone nowhere. Quite the contrary, it's an important trade agreement, and I think it would bond our ties closer, realizing that this is very difficult under Trump. Second, if you want to find one mega project, work together on technology, because I think fundamentally our values linked to technology are the same. The US has the tech giants. The EU is a regulatory power. Find some kind of congruence between these two and work together on issues linked to technology. I think that's where the biggest differences are going to be between China and then on one hand and the US and Europe on the other.
Konstantin.
Yeah, I fully agree. I think that TTIP has been important. I think that under a different administration, we can jumpstart the process, and I think that after Trump, everything is possible. The new mega issues, I would say two. The first one, I agree with Alexander. I think technology is one. The second, I believe, is China. And I think that reality has a very hard time imposing itself on foreign affairs. And I think that a comprehensive Western response to China is at issue here. Because, if we have a decoupling of the transatlantic space, an isolated America and a vulnerable Europe cannot come up with an effective response to China. I think that the rise of China is such that will foster more unity to the transatlantic space. So I think the next big thing for US-European relations are all the facets of relations with China: economic, technological, hard geopolitical issues, and so on.
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, look, on TTIP, as much as I'd like to think that it's easily revived, we need to be a little cautious about this. I mean, the truth is, if we think back to the experience, it was already in trouble long before Trump came to power. For both sides of the Atlantic, actually, for different reasons, most of them nothing to do with trade. And, to put all of those challenges back in the box and to move forward with a new kind of formula, it's possible if there's political will on both sides, but it's going to take a lot of leadership and a lot of energy to do it. And maybe there are some areas, some sectors where it's possible to have some progress. And that takes you to the second point, where I fully agree with what's been said. I would agree with everybody and say, look, in my short list, you have technology, you have China, and you also have climate. But in fact, if you take those three together, what is the thread, frankly, that's running through them? It's technology in both cases. Regulation of technology, the policy around technology, and then, of course, the technology itself. Publics, if you look at the public opinion polling, even in the context of this extraordinary crisis we have going at the moment, they still say climate matters. And so I think we need to pay attention to that. I think that this is one of the areas where you could most easily have a reset on the other side of the Atlantic if we have a different outcome in November.
So it's pretty much impossible to wrap up such a discussion, but I have to come slowly to the conclusion of this debate. So allow me a joke: be it a marriage of love or a marriage of interest, it seems that this transatlantic marriage will last. Do you agree with that? Final short comment.
It's a dysfunctional marriage, but it will last.
Okay, so it will last. And Alexander too.
Yeah, definitely. I'll be sending hearts across the Atlantic. It will last, and it will last, and it should last. And you know, these things happen. I think we need to renew our marriage vows after the November elections.
Jan, final comments?
Well, look, I mean, coming from GMF, an American living in Brussels for the last 7 years, I think you can guess what I'm going to say, which is pretty much exactly as Alexander has said. So invite me to the vow renewal party, and we'll be happy to do that.
So that means also that the title of the paper of Professor Arvanitopoulos was very rightly chosen, the renewal of vows, and it will happen anytime soon. So I know that we will continue for hours, but unfortunately we run out of time. So let me thank you for being with us, and also our online viewers for following actively this debate. Of course, we will keep following new developments from both sides of the Atlantic, and I encourage you to continue the discussion with us on our social media. The video of the debate will remain available on our platforms, so feel free to comment and share. Stay safe, stay informed, and keep following us.